Plato, born in Athens in 427 BCE, is one of the most famous names in philosophy. But beyond his wisdom and big ideas about truth and beauty, he was also deeply suspicious of democracy. Why? Because he lived through its dark side. As a young man, he saw Athens defeat itself through mob decisions, and he watched his own teacher, Socrates, sentenced to death by a popular jury. For Plato, ordinary citizens acting on emotion instead of reason led not to freedom, but to chaos. In his most famous work, The Republic, he built a radically different vision of society. Instead of leaders chosen by the people, he wanted rule by philosopher kings, highly trained thinkers raised from youth to prize wisdom over wealth or power. To Plato, politics wasn't about opinion, it was about knowledge. Just as you wouldn't let a random crowd fly a plane, you shouldn't let a random crowd run a city. Democracy, in his view, was like putting children in charge of a ship. Plato's ideal state was strict and hierarchical. Guardians at the top made decisions, auxiliaries enforced order, and producers, farmers, merchants, workers provided for society. Everyone had a role, and stepping outside it threatened stability. He even argued for censoring art, controlling education, and regulating family life to keep the city unified. While his republic was never built, his influence was enormous. Authoritarian rulers later quoted Plato to justify elite control, while critics warned that his blueprint looked like a totalitarian nightmare. More than 2,000 years later, his distrust of democracy keeps sparking debate. Was Plato protecting truth or suppressing freedom? That tension is why his defense of authoritarian orders still fascinates and unsettles us today. Aristotle, born in 384 BCE in northern Greece, was Plato's student and later tutor to Alexander the Great. Unlike Plato's dream of philosopher kings, Aristotle focused on practical observation, studying politics, ethics, biology, even drama. He believed everything in nature had a purpose, and human society was no different. Order, to him, came from recognizing natural roles. That's where his defense of hierarchy becomes clear. In his Politics, Aristotle argued that some people were natural rulers and others were natural subjects. He claimed certain humans lacked the full capacity for reason and were better off being directed by others. That was his justification for slavery. Masters provided rational leadership, while slaves provided labor. By his logic, both supposedly benefited. He extended this thinking to the family and the city. Men, he said, were fitted to rule. Women were subordinate because of what he considered weaker rational faculties. And just as families had masters and servants, cities needed leaders and citizens who obeyed them. For Aristotle, hierarchy wasn't just convenient, it was built into nature itself. Now, was Aristotle pushing for total authoritarianism? Not quite. He saw value in mixed governments and the rule of law. But his insistence on fixed inequality laid intellectual foundations for centuries of rigid structures. Slaveholders in Greece and Rome cited him. Medieval thinkers leaned on his writings, and debates on gender roles traced back to his claims. Even today, critics revisit Aristotle as a reminder of how natural order has been used to defend oppression. His brilliance as a philosopher is unquestioned, but his belief in permanent hierarchies shows how easily reason can be turned into a justification for authority and control. Thomas Hobbes, born in 1588, entered the world during crisis, literally the year the Spanish Armada threatened England. He once joked that fear and himself were twins. That sense of fear would define his philosophy. Living through the English Civil War, Hobbes watched political collapse, brutal violence, and neighbors turning against neighbors. To him, this wasn't just history. It was proof of human nature. In his view, people left alone were selfish, aggressive, and competitive. Life without authority, he famously warned, would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. His solution came in 1651 with Leviathan. Hobbes argued that peace was only possible if people surrendered most of their freedoms to an all-powerful sovereign, a monarch or state strong enough to keep order by fear. He compared the state to a giant artificial being, built from the consent of its people, but holding unchecked power. Once authority was given, it couldn't be taken back. For Hobbes, questioning the sovereign created the very chaos government was meant to stop. This theory shocked many of his contemporaries, who were fighting for parliamentary limits on kings. Hobbes was seen as defending dictatorship, yet his vision of a social contract also became a cornerstone in political thought, later reshaped by Locke and Rousseau in more democratic directions. The long shadow of Hobbes is clear. Modern debates on surveillance, strong states, and emergency powers all echo his warnings. He believed freedom without security was worthless, and only absolute authority could save us from ourselves. Whether you see that as realism or tyranny, that's why Hobbes still divides readers 4 centuries later. Niccolò Machiavelli, born in Florence in 1469, lived through one of the most chaotic political climates in European history. The Italian city-states were constantly at war, foreign powers invaded, and rulers were overthrown overnight. For Machiavelli, politics wasn't about ideals, it was about survival. His most notorious book, The Prince, written in 1513, shattered illusions about virtuous leadership. Instead of asking how rulers should behave, he asked how they must behave to keep power. His answer was blunt: forget moral rules when they threaten stability. A ruler, he argued, must learn to be cunning like a fox and strong like a lion. It's better to be feared than loved, he said, if you can't be both, because fear keeps people obedient. Machiavelli advised that cruelty, deception, and manipulation weren't moral failings in politics. They were tools. Promise what you must, break promises when convenient, and always put the survival of the state above everything else. For him, effectiveness beat morality every time. At the time, his ideas scandalized Europe. Critics branded him the devil's teacher, and the word Machiavellian still means ruthless scheming today. Yet rulers from Medici to modern politicians have quietly used his strategies. The Prince became one of the first true manuals of realpolitik, politics stripped of illusions. His long-term impact is huge. He gave us the language of power politics, influenced thinkers like Hobbes, and still sparks debate over whether honest leadership is even possible. Machiavelli didn't glorify cruelty for its own sake. He simply believed that in a dangerous world, a ruler who clings to morality won't last. And in his eyes, survival of the state justified everything. Jean Bodin, born in 1530 in France, lived through the French Wars of Religion, a violent era when Catholics and Protestants slaughtered each other in the streets. For him, political instability was not abstract philosophy, it was daily reality. Order, he believed, demanded a power strong enough to rise above factions. In his major work, 6 Books of the Commonwealth, 1576, Bodin laid out one of the earliest modern defenses of absolute sovereignty. He argued that every state needs a single authority who cannot be challenged by parliaments, courts, or even religious leaders. For Bodin, sovereignty meant the ruler had the final say on lawmaking, justice, and war, power that was perpetual, indivisible, and supreme. Why so extreme? Because he saw divided authority as the root cause of civil conflict. If laws could be questioned, if rulers could be resisted, society would fragment into chaos. Only near unlimited power, he claimed, could preserve unity and stability. Importantly, Bodin didn't argue kings were above morality. He thought rulers were bound by natural law and God. But in practice, no earthly institution could check them. His defense of sovereignty shaped monarchies across Europe. French kings cited him to justify centralized absolute rule, and his ideas fed into later theories of the nation-state and even Hobbes' Leviathan. Critics, however, warned that sovereignty without accountability was a path toward tyranny. Bodin's long-term legacy is clear. He helped invent the modern concept of the state itself. When you hear about government sovereignty today, borders, non-interference, state authority, you're hearing echoes of Bodin's 16th century insistence that stability depends on a ruler whose power cannot be divided. Sir Robert Filmer, born in 1588 in England, grew up during the turbulent years of the Stuart monarchy, when arguments about royal power versus parliament were threatening to tear the country apart. Filmer took sides completely with the king. His most famous work, Patriarcha, written in the early 1600s, argued that monarchy wasn't just a convenient political system, it was ordained by God. To Filmer, kings ruled like fathers over a family, and just as children don't get to vote their dad out of authority, subjects had no right to challenge their king. Popular consent, parliaments, even resistance to tyranny, all of that, he thought, was dangerous nonsense. His reasoning was rooted in biblical history. He claimed that from Adam onward, authority naturally passed down like inheritance. That meant political power was patriarchal by design. Trying to give people a say in government was not freedom, in his mind, but rebellion against the natural order. At the time, Stuart kings like James I and Charles I loved ideas like Filmer's because they gave religious and intellectual cover to their fight against parliamentary limits. But during the English Civil War, when Charles I was executed and monarchy itself fell, Filmer's defense of divine right was pushed aside. His writings were largely ignored until decades later, when they were revived, ironically, so that John Locke could demolish them. Locke's first treatise of government is basically a point-by-point takedown of Filmer, and it gave birth to the liberal idea of government by consent. Filmer's legacy, then, is strange but important. Almost no one today openly defends divine right, but his work shaped one of history's biggest turning points. By defending unchecked paternal monarchy, he forced later thinkers to prove why freedom, rights, and democracy mattered. In that way, Filmer's authoritarian argument ended up fueling the very tradition he opposed. Giovanni Botero, born in 1544 in Italy, lived through the Counter-Reformation, a time when the Catholic Church was fighting to reassert control against Protestantism and political fragmentation across Europe. If Machiavelli had shocked the world by stripping politics of morality, Botero set out to put morality, specifically Catholic morality, back at the center, but still in the service of strong centralized power. His most influential work, The Reason of State, 1589, became a defining text on governance. Unlike Machiavelli, who said rulers should do whatever works, Botero argued rulers must govern in line with divine and moral law. But here's the kicker. He still believed that stability and unity demanded centralized authority. A fragmented, weak government couldn't defend the faith, protect society, or suppress rebellion. For Botero, the state's purpose wasn't just keeping order. It was ensuring the survival of religion and the moral health of its people. That meant rulers had broad power to enforce religious conformity, regulate social behavior, and use political strength to uphold Catholic teaching. Where Machiavelli had said, power for power's sake, Botero essentially said, power for God's sake. His thinking fit perfectly with the climate of Counter-Reformation Catholic monarchies, like Spain under Philip II, that saw the unity of throne and altar as essential. Botero also influenced early modern discussions of population, economics, and empire, always with the theme that strong rulers were guardians of both faith and stability. In the long view, his work shows how authoritarian ideas didn't only come from raw cynicism about human nature. They also grew from religious conviction that truth must be defended from error, even if that required centralized force. Botero's lesson is stark. Authoritarianism can creep in not just for survival, but in the name of salvation. Joseph de Maistre, born in 1753 in the Kingdom of Savoy, lived through the shockwaves of the French Revolution, one of the most violent challenges to monarchy and the Catholic Church in European history. Where Enlightenment liberals saw progress and freedom, de Maistre saw disaster. To him, the revolution proved that tearing down hierarchy unleashed chaos, terror, and bloodshed. In his works, especially Considerations on France and St. Petersburg Dialogues, de Maistre became one of the fiercest defenders of tradition and authority. He argued that monarchs rule not because of human consent, but because God ordains them. Kings, priests, and established hierarchy weren't just political conveniences. They were divine instruments holding society together. Without them, he insisted, humanity falls into violence and disorder. De Maistre praised the authority of the Church as the moral compass of civilization and defended absolute monarchy as the necessary glue of political life. Equality, secularism, and democracy weren't progress in his eyes, but dangerous illusions that ignored humanity's need for order, authority, and sacrifice. He even claimed that institutions like war and capital punishment were part of God's mysterious plan to discipline mankind. His writings made him a leading figure of the counter-enlightenment, inspiring reactionary movements throughout 19th century Europe. While liberal democracies saw him as extreme, even sinister, conservatives and monarchists embraced him as a prophet warning against revolutionary hubris. De Maistre's long-term legacy is sharp and polarizing. He shows us how authoritarianism can be defended not with cold cynicism, but with fiery conviction rooted in religion and tradition. For him, freedom without hierarchy wasn't freedom at all. It was an invitation to collapse. Carl Schmitt, born in Germany in 1888, lived through World War I, the collapse of the German Empire, and the unstable Weimar Republic. To him, liberal democracy was weak, endless debates, fragile coalitions, and parliaments that couldn't protect order. Out of that frustration, he developed one of the most influential defenses of authoritarian power in the 20th century. Schmitt's central idea was blunt. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception. What he meant is that real political authority isn't about writing laws. It's about deciding when to suspend them. In times of crisis, when the survival of the state is at stake, constitutions and parliaments become secondary. Only a decisive leader, standing above the rules, can protect the political community. In works like Political Theology and the Concept of the Political, Schmitt attacked liberalism's faith in neutral rules and endless discussion. Politics, he argued, is not about compromise, It's about the friend-slash-enemy distinction, drawing hard lines to defend the community from its enemies. To him, liberal institutions were masks that hid real power. In the 1930s, Schmitt openly supported the Nazis, providing legal justifications for dictatorship and persecution. After the war, his reputation was permanently scarred, but his writings never disappeared. His idea of the state of exception has since been used to analyze, and sometimes defend, strong executive powers, emergency states, and the authority of rulers who claim survival of the nation outweighs the rule of law. Schmitt's legacy is dark but enduring. He forces us to ask, in moments of true crisis, do we want stability at any cost, even the suspension of law? His authoritarian logic shows how fragile the idea of liberal democracy can be when the exception becomes the rule. Martin Heidegger, born in 1889 in Germany, is often called one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. His masterpiece being, in time, reshaped existentialism and phenomenology, exploring themes of human existence, mortality, and authenticity. But his intellectual brilliance was shadowed by a disturbing political choice. In 1933, Heidegger openly supported Adolf Hitler's rise and became rector of Freiburg University under Nazi rule. In practice, Heidegger used his prestige to align with the regime's authoritarian vision of destiny and unity. He gave speeches praising Hitler as Germany's spiritual leader, and he tied his philosophical language of authentic existence and historical destiny to the idea of a national rebirth under totalitarian control. Terms like obedience, sacrifice for the vote, and the call of history slid from abstract philosophy into political allegiance. Although he resigned from his rector post a year later and distanced himself from some Nazi policies, Heidegger never publicly condemned the regime afterward. His silence on the Holocaust and continued reflections on technology, destiny, and power kept fueling debates about whether his philosophy itself was contaminated by authoritarian sympathies. The long-term impact is paradoxical. On one hand, his thought deeply influenced existentialists, postmodernists, and literary theory worldwide. On the other, his ties to Nazism make him a case study in how philosophy can be entangled with authoritarian politics. To this day, readers split between separating the thinker from the thought or seeing his ideas as forever marked. Heidegger's story shows that authoritarianism isn't always justified with blunt slogans or laws. Sometimes it slips in through the language of destiny, authenticity, and historical necessity, ideas with enormous power to inspire and to mislead. Feizi, born around 280 BCE, lived during China's Warring States period, a brutal era when rival kingdoms fought for dominance. Unlike Confucian thinkers who preached harmony through virtue and moral example, Feizi drew a hard lesson from the chaos. Human beings can't be trusted to act out of goodness. Order, he believed, required something stronger, unbending laws, harsh punishments, and centralized authority. In his writings, later compiled as the Feizi, he argued that rulers should rely not on personal virtue or loyalty, but on systems. Laws must be clear, rewards precise, and punishments severe, so that everyone obeys out of necessity, not out of voluntary goodness. He dismissed Confucian call for rulers to be benevolent fathers, calling them naive. People, he thought, respond to incentives and fear, nothing more. Feizi also warned rulers to distrust ministers, nobles, even family. Only a strong central monarch, armed with strict laws and backed by force, could secure stability. He famously stuttered when speaking, but his piercing arguments made him a leading advisor to rulers of the Qin state. Qin Shi Huang, who later unified China as its first emperor, embraced legalist principles directly inspired by Feizi's ideas. The results were dramatic. China was unified in 221 BCE under a centralized empire built on rigid law codes, harsh discipline, book burnings, and suppression of dissent. But the dynasty collapsed within 15 years, showing both the effectiveness and the brittleness of pure authoritarian control. Feizi's legacy remains powerful. Legalism shaped Chinese governance for centuries, resurfacing in later dynasties and even in modern debates about order versus freedom. His philosophy stands as one of history's most explicit defenses of authoritarian rule. Forget virtue. Only law and power keep society intact. Confucius, born in 551 BCE in China during the Spring and Autumn period, is often remembered as a gentle moral teacher, preaching benevolence, respect, and self-cultivation. He wanted a world where rulers governed with virtue and people lived in harmony through ritual and moral discipline. But here's the controversial part. The system he designed placed obedience and hierarchy at its very core. In his Analects, Confucius describes society as a set of structured relationships: ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, elder and younger. Each role carried duties, and harmony came when everyone stayed in place. Rulers should act as virtuous fathers, but in return, subjects were expected to obey loyally. Dissent, rebellion, and breaking roles disrupted the cosmic order. While Confucius himself argued for benevolent leadership, the ruler should lead by moral example rather than cruelty. Later dynasties seized on the emphasis on loyalty, order, and rigid roles. Imperial Chinese governments institutionalized Confucian ideals through civil service exams and education systems, teaching obedience to hierarchy as the backbone of political stability for over 2,000 years. Critics argue this laid the groundwork for authoritarian control. Once loyalty is sacred and rulers are like fathers, questioning authority feels like disobedience to the natural order. In practice, Confucian harmony often meant suppressing dissent. Supporters, though, see his system as a defense of ethical leadership, not tyranny. Confucius's long legacy is why he remains controversial. Was he an advocate of moral order or an enabler of authoritarian rule through hierarchy and obedience? Either way, his teachings show how ideas meant for virtue can evolve into powerful tools of control. Auguste Comte, born in 1798 in France, lived in the turbulent aftermath of the French Revolution and Napoleon's empire. For him, the chaos of revolution and the instability of liberal politics pointed to a single need: order. But unlike clerics or monarchists before him, Comte proposed something new: society should be ruled by science. Comte is often called the founder of positivism, the philosophy that true knowledge comes only from observable facts and scientific reasoning. He believed human history moved through three stages: theological, metaphysical, and finally scientific. In this positive stage, superstition and political squabbles would give way to rational planning by experts. But here's where the authoritarian streak shows. Comte argued that instead of messy democratic debate, society would be better guided by a technocratic elite: scientists, engineers, and philosophers who understood the laws of human progress. These social physicists, as he sometimes called them, would organize education, economics, and morality with the precision of science. Citizens' role wasn't to debate policy, but to follow the order laid down by knowledge. He even envisioned a kind of religion of humanity, where society would rally around a secular priesthood of scientists instead of traditional church authority. In short, he replaced kings and bishops with professors and scientists, but the hierarchy and obedience remained. Comte's influence spread into sociology, political science, and the cult of technocracy that still echoes today whenever experts are seen as the natural rulers of society. His message was clear: freedom mattered less than order, and order depended on elite knowledge. Whether you see him as a visionary of progress or an authoritarian cloaked in science, Comte reminds us of a dangerous temptation: to think expertise alone can justify power. Hegel, born in 1770 in Germany, was one of the giants of modern philosophy. His system was vast, covering history, logic, politics, and even art, but at its heart was the belief that freedom wasn't just about individuals doing whatever they want. True freedom, Hegel argued, came from recognition, duty, and living within rational institutions. In his Philosophy of Right, 1820, Hegel described the state not as a necessary evil, but as the highest realization of human freedom. Families taught love, civil society managed needs, but the state united all of it into a rational whole. And for Hegel, the best example wasn't democracy or revolution. It was the Prussian monarchy of his own day. He saw the modern state as the embodiment of reason itself, a structure where individuals gained freedom by obeying laws that expressed the universal will. This meant citizens were most free not in resisting the state, but in submitting to it because the state represented their higher rational nature. Critics quickly pointed out the authoritarian implications. If the state is the embodiment of reason, then challenging it isn't brave dissent, it's irrational. Hegel's praise of the Prussian constitutional monarchy, with its bureaucracy, army, and centralized authority, has long been interpreted as a defense of authoritarian structures masquerading as freedom. His legacy is complicated. Leftist thinkers like Marx took Hegel's dialectics but turned them against the state. Conservatives and nationalists, meanwhile, leaned on his vision of state unity as a justification for strong, centralized control. Hegel's lesson is double-edged. He wanted to show how freedom is only real through community and law, but his vision of the rational state walked dangerously close to saying the state is always right. And that, in practice, has made him both a prophet of modern freedom and a philosopher of authoritarian order. Friedrich Nietzsche, born in 1844 in Germany, is famous for declaring God is dead and tearing apart the moral foundations of Western culture. But beyond the sound bites, his philosophy is a sharp critique of democracy, equality, and what he called herd morality. Nietzsche believed that most people lived small, conformist lives, clinging to religion, tradition, or social approval. This herd, he thought, resented individuality and strength, and used ideas like equality and morality to hold back the exceptional. True culture, he argued, advances only when societies elevate rare, higher men, creative geniuses, and leaders who shape history. In works like Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche praised the will to power, humanity's drive towards strength, creativity, and self-overcoming. Where liberal democracy sought inclusion and equality, Nietzsche saw mediocrity and decline. He dreamed instead of an aristocratic order, led by individuals bold enough to create their own values and push humanity forward. Here lies the controversy. Nietzsche himself despised nationalism and anti-Semitism, yet his writings on hierarchy and the Übermensch, or Overman, were later twisted by fascist ideologues, including the Nazis, to justify racial superiority and authoritarian control. His sister even edited and distorted his notes to align with those politics. The result was a weaponized Nietzsche, far from his original intent, but influential all the same. Nietzsche's long-term impact is immense. He inspired existentialism, postmodernism, psychoanalysis, and modern critiques of mass culture. But he also shows how dangerous ideas about hierarchy, strength, and elite rule can be co-opted into authoritarian systems. In short, Nietzsche never wrote a manual for tyrants, but his rejection of equality and his exaltation of the few over the many gave authoritarian power a dangerous philosophical vocabulary it has used ever since.